Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was nearing midnight when Sarah finished her last task. She was used to staying late. The office was quiet, and the stillness helped her concentrate. But tonight was different. Tonight, the air felt heavier, like the building was alive, watching her. The office was large, with rows of cubicles and long hallways lined with conference rooms and storage closets. The fluorescent lights above buzzed intermittently, adding an eerie hum to the otherwise silent space. Sarah glanced at her watch. 12:07 a.m. She hadn't intended to stay this late. She was supposed to have finished her project by 5 p.m., but a last-minute meeting with her boss and some urgent emails had pushed her hours beyond what she'd planned. The office was empty now, with only her and the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Taking a deep breath, Sarah packed up her things, ready to leave. As she reached for her coat, the lights flickered above her. She paused, her hand still on the coat hook. She wasn't sure if it was just the aging light fixtures or something else, but the sudden flicker sent a chill down her spine. She shook it off. "Just tired," she muttered under her breath. She zipped up her jacket and grabbed her bag. But just as she turned to leave, she heard it, a faint noise, almost like a low creaking sound. It came from the direction of the break room. She froze, listening. At first, she thought it was just the building settling, as old buildings often do. But then she heard it again, a soft rustling sound like someone moving around in the dark. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice louder than she intended, cutting through the silence. No answer. With a hesitant glance toward the hallway, Sarah told herself it was probably just the cleaning crew, though they weren't scheduled to come in for another hour. She grabbed her phone from her bag, ready to call the security guard, but as she began to dial, she heard a door creak open. This time, it was closer. Much closer. Her pulse quickened. "Is someone there?" she asked, trying to sound confident, though she wasn't sure if she even believed the words herself. No answer. Her phone buzzed in her hand and she looked down at it, startled. It was a message from her best friend, Emily. "You still at the office? Everything okay?" Sarah quickly typed back. "Just finishing up. No big deal, but it's a little creepy tonight." As soon as she hit send, another noise came. This time, a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy had dropped onto the floor from the conference room at the far end of the office. Sarah's heart raced. She tried to dismiss it as a random occurrence, maybe just the air vent shifting or a chair tipping over, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was in the building with her. "Maybe I'm just tired," she whispered to herself, turning to head toward the elevator. But as she walked toward the elevator, the air felt colder. She could see her breath, just a faint puff of condensation in the dim light. Sarah stopped, confused. She didn't feel cold before. Shaking her head, she pressed the elevator button. The faint chime echoed down the empty hallway. And she stepped inside as the doors opened. The elevator descended slowly, almost too slowly, and the feeling of unease in her chest deepened. She stared at the floor, her reflection faint in the polished surface. That's when she heard it, clearer now. A whisper. The voice was soft, almost like a breath against her ear. "Sarah." Her heart stopped. She whipped around, but no one was there. The elevator doors closed, and she felt a sudden weight press down on her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to ignore the mounting panic. She wasn't imagining it. The voice had been real. She knew it. The elevator stopped. The doors opened with a soft chime. Sarah stepped out into the lobby, her body tense, every muscle alert. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she wasn't alone. As she made her way to the front door, the lobby lights flickered, just like before. A sharp, sudden flicker. Then the door handle rattled. She spun around, her breath shallow, and saw the security guard standing at the front desk, looking at her with a puzzled expression. "Everything okay, miss?" he asked. Sarah exhaled in relief, her chest loosening. "Yeah," she said quickly, trying to calm her racing heart. I thought I heard something." The guard raised an eyebrow. "The building makes odd noises late at night," he said, chuckling lightly. "It's nothing. You heading out?" Sarah nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm leaving now." The guard gave her a friendly wave, and she walked out into the cold night air, thankful to be away from the office. But as she stepped into her car, she couldn't shake the unease that had followed her from the building. She told herself it was nothing. That night, as she tried to sleep, the voice echoed in her mind. Sarah. She tried to brush it off, but the thought of the whisper wouldn't leave her. The next day, she returned to work, determined to put it behind her. But when she stepped off the elevator, something felt off. The air felt thick, and there was a lingering, uncomfortable feeling that she couldn't shake. When she reached her desk, she stopped short. Computer screen was on. It shouldn't have been. She'd turned it off the night before. She walked over slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she saw what was on the screen. A message, typed out in a font she didn't recognize. Why are you here? Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to think. She wasn't sure if it was some kind of prank or something worse. She turned to her colleague Matt, who was sitting nearby. He looked up from his own screen. Matt, she said, her voice tight. Did you, mess with my computer last night? Matt frowned, looking confused. No. Why? She gestured to the screen. Look. He walked over and stared at the words, then shook his head. I don't know what that is, but I didn't do it. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and Sarah felt her skin prickle. Maybe the system's glitching, Matt suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Maybe, Sarah replied, though she wasn't so sure anymore. That afternoon, she spoke to the building's maintenance worker, trying to brush off her discomfort. Any chance the office computers are haunted? She asked, laughing nervously. The maintenance worker, who had worked in the building for years, paused. Well, funny you ask, he said, his voice low. There have been a few strange things around here over the years. Lights flickering, equipment acting up. I don't know if it's just the age of the building, but... He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Sarah felt a chill. What do you mean? He hesitated, then added, They say the building's got some history. It used to be a different kind of office, a different kind of business. People say the place is haunted. Haunted? Sarah repeated, her heart sinking. He nodded. I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing, but that you're not the first to hear things in the hallways late at night. She wanted to laugh it off, but she couldn't. Something about the way he said it made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something terrifyingly real. That night, Sarah decided to leave early. She couldn't stand the feeling of being watched anymore. She grabbed her things and walked quickly toward the elevator, glancing over her shoulder. When she stepped outside into the cold air, she knew she wasn't alone, not in the building and not in her mind. Something had followed her home, and it wasn't just a whisper anymore. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The office was quieter than usual, the only sound being the rhythmic tapping of keys on Jenna's keyboard. She had stayed late again to meet a deadline for her boss. It wasn't anything new. She was accustomed to working past the usual office hours when everyone else had gone home and the building felt empty. But tonight, it felt different. The hum of the lights, the slight creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her, the distant sounds of the city below, it all seemed to create a heavy atmosphere. Jenna was used to the silence, even liked it in some ways. It gave her the focus she needed to get things done without distractions. But tonight, there was an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite place, a sensation she couldn't shake. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she was just tired. She glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m. A few more hours, she thought. She could finish this. The office was old, one of those buildings that had seen better days. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the wood floors creaked as you walked across them. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, and the old HVAC system groaned every now and then. The air felt dry, but the temperature had dropped slightly, leaving an uncomfortable chill in the office. Jenna adjusted her sweater, rubbing her arms as she stared at her computer screen. The cursor blinked at her, waiting for her to type the next line of her report. But her mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling in the room. It was as if she wasn't alone. She had heard noises earlier, a faint scraping sound, like a chair being moved across the floor. She had dismissed it as the building settling, but now she wasn't so sure. Every so often there was a creak from somewhere behind her. At first, she thought it was just the aging structure of the building, but it sounded too deliberate, too consistent. She paused in her typing and glanced around the room. The other desks were empty, their chairs pushed in, papers stacked neatly. The faint glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. Nothing unusual. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up, relieved for the distraction. It was a message from her friend, Laura. "Are you still at work?" the text read. Jenna smiled. "Yep, just finishing up some things. I'll be home soon." She set her phone back down, but as she reached for her mouse to return to her report, she heard it again, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, like someone tapping a pen against a desk. Jenna froze. The sound was coming from behind her, from the direction of the break room. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. The break room was empty, its door slightly ajar. "Probably just the air conditioning," she muttered under her breath, trying to convince herself. She turned back to her computer, but the tapping didn't stop. It continued, steady and deliberate. Jenna's fingers paused above her keyboard. The sound was closer now, almost as if it were directly behind her. She stood up, her heart suddenly pounding. The tapping stopped. "Hello?" she called out, trying to sound braver than she felt. No response. She stepped toward the break room, slowly, the silence around her growing louder with each step. She reached the door and pushed it open, her eyes scanning the small space. There was nothing unusual inside. Just the usual coffee machine, the sink, the half-empty box of donuts from earlier that day. The room was cold, colder than she expected. The temperature in the office had dropped significantly, and a chill ran through her as she closed the door and turned back to her desk. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of her computer screen, there was a dark shape moving across the room, just behind her. It was faint at first, like a shadow stretching along the floor. Then it took form. Slowly, deliberately, a figure in the dim light. Jenna's blood ran cold. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her desk chair creaked as it swiveled with the sudden movement. Her breath caught in her throat. The shadow in the reflection was gone. But she could still feel it. The presence. The weight of something behind her. Something watching. She looked back at her screen, trying to focus on her work, but her hands were shaking. The tapping sound started again, but this time it was closer. Closer than ever. She turned back to face the empty office, her eyes scanning the room. Nothing. Her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Laura. "Are you okay? You're not answering." Jenna's fingers trembled as she typed back. "Yeah, just finishing up. Be home soon." She stood up from her desk, the tapping still echoing in the back of her mind. She needed a break. She needed to get out of the office, even if just for a few minutes. She grabbed her purse and coat and headed toward the exit. But as she walked toward the door, she heard it again. This time it was louder, more frantic. The sound of footsteps, not from behind her, but from the hallway. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, but the hallway was empty. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Her pulse raced as she walked toward the door, her hand trembling on the doorknob. The footsteps followed her, matching her pace. They were getting closer, but when she turned to look, there was no one there. She was no longer sure what was real. The cold draft returned, stronger this time, as if the temperature had dropped even further. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message from Laura. It was a call. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the caller ID. It was from the office manager. She picked up the phone, her voice shaking. "Hello? Jenna?" The voice on the other end said, her tone shaky. "Are you still there? We just got a call from the security company. They said the cameras went offline for a few minutes." Jenna's throat tightened. She glanced around the office. The lights flickered overhead. Srap. The cameras were supposed to be on a separate system, far more reliable than anything else in the building. The security company had never called about them before. Jenna started, but her words faltered as she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, moving down the hallway toward her. It was like the air itself had thickened, making each step seem heavier, as though something was dragging itself along. The voice on the phone continued, unaware of what was happening. "Jenna, are you there?" Jenna's voice caught in her throat. "I need to leave. She didn't finish the sentence. The footsteps stopped at the door. Jenna felt a sharp breath of cold air against the back of her neck. The silence that followed was deafening. "Jenna?" The voice on the phone called, frantic now. "Is everything okay?" Jenna slowly turned toward the door. The handle was shaking. She didn't know how, but somehow she could feel it. Whatever was on the other side. She stepped back from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't wait for another second. Without a word, she dropped the phone, grabbed her bag, and bolted for the exit. The sound of footsteps followed her all the way to the door. But when she looked behind her, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, as silent as it had been when she first walked in. The door slammed behind her as she stepped into the night air, gasping for breath. Jenna didn't go back to the office the next day. She filed for a transfer and left that job. Sometimes when she walks past the building on her way home, she feels that same chill creeping up her spine. The office is still there, though, sitting in the heart of the city. And sometimes, if you stand close enough to the windows late at night, you can see a figure watching from inside.
Story number 3.
It was a typical Thursday evening when Sarah found herself alone in the office, working on a report that had to be submitted by the end of the week. The fluorescent lights hummed above, the sound an unchanging companion to her exhaustion. She had been at it for hours, typing away at her computer, feeling the weight of the empty office pressing in around her. The building was quiet. Too quiet. She glanced at the clock. 9:45 p.m. Everyone had left hours ago, leaving the space eerily still. Sarah didn't mind working late. The quiet allowed her to focus. But tonight, something felt off. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than usual, and there was a coldness in the air that had nothing to do with the AC. She wrapped her sweater tightly around herself, trying to dismiss the discomfort creeping up her spine. The building was old, an office space in a converted warehouse. It had character, but the kind of character that made you wonder about its history. The thick, creaky wooden floors and high ceilings gave the place a certain charm, but there were also corners of the building that always felt wrong. Sarah had worked here for nearly 2 years and had learned to ignore the occasional strange noise. The creak of floorboards when no one was around, the sound of something skittering just out of sight. Everyone chalked it up to the building settling, or the HVAC system working its quirks. She had never put much thought into it until tonight. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as the tapping of the keys suddenly seemed louder in the quiet room. The sensation of being watched crept over her. She froze, her heart racing. Her breath was shallow as she turned to look behind her. The office was empty, just rows of desks, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. She laughed nervously to herself. "Get a grip, Sarah," she muttered under her breath. She spun back to her desk and started typing again, focusing on the task at hand. The sound of a door creaking open broke her concentration. Sarah turned toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. The door at the far end of the office was slowly swinging open. She frowned, her stomach tightening. She was certain she had closed that door when she entered the office earlier. Probably just the wind, she said to herself, though she didn't quite believe it. The building had no windows at the far end of the hallway, and the air vents were silent. She got up to check, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The hallway was dark, lit only by the pale light from the office. The door creaked again, swinging slightly as if someone or something was moving in the space beyond. "Hello?" she called out, but no one answered. The silence that followed felt suffocating. No footsteps, no voices, just the overwhelming sense that something was waiting in the dark. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She stepped toward the door, her heart pounding with each step. The second her hand reached for the handle, the air seemed to grow colder. A chill rushed over her, the kind that felt unnatural, like something was close by but unseen. Her fingers brushed against the handle, and for a moment she hesitated. Something about the emptiness of the hallway made her blood run cold. She quickly turned the knob and pushed the door open. It was empty. The restroom was just as she had left it, dark, quiet, and unoccupied. She stepped back, her breath coming faster now, but she shook her head and dismissed the feeling. It was just nerves. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe it was the isolation, the quiet, the stillness of the night. The creak of the door, the chill in the air, the shadows. Maybe they were all just tricks of her mind. But as Sarah walked back toward her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was there. She returned to her seat, staring at the flickering computer screen. Her fingers hovered over the mouse, but she couldn't focus. Her gaze kept drifting to the empty office around her, and her pulse quickened as the silence pressed in on her. And then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed in the hallway. Her heart leaped into her throat. She stood up quickly, eyes scanning the hallway, but there was no one. The hallway was empty, and there was no sign of movement. The footsteps continued, growing louder, coming closer. Sarah's breathing became erratic. She grabbed her phone from her desk and dialed the number of the security guard. "Hello? This is Sarah from the second floor," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm still here. Can you check the security cameras? There's someone else in the building." There was a pause on the other end, then a low, calm voice. "I'm the only one here, Sarah. The cameras are working fine. No one else is on the footage. Are you sure you're not just hearing things?" Sarah's eyes darted back to the hallway. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the space again, heavier now than before. She glanced nervously at the clock. 15 p.m. Her voice faltered, and she quickly ended the call. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she had heard something. The hairs on the back of her neck were standing up, and her heart was thumping loudly in her chest. As she sat back down, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure darker than the shadows themselves seemed to shift in the far corner of the room. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. The figure didn't move like a person. It seemed to glide, almost liquid in its movement. It was dark, amorphous, and yet unmistakably present. Her breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she whispered hoarsely, trying to steady her voice, but the words came out thin and unsteady. The figure did not respond. It just lingered in the corner like a presence, watching her. And then, without warning, it moved closer. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off it, even as it seemed to grow closer with each passing second. The figure was now standing in the middle of the room, no longer a mere shadow, but a solid shape that felt wrong in every possible way. Its presence was suffocating, its very essence wrong. The lights above her flickered. The temperature in the room dropped significantly, and Sarah could see her breath in front of her, a thin mist forming in the cold air. The figure took a step forward, a noise behind her, a scrape of metal against metal, shattered the stillness, and Sarah whirled around. The filing cabinet at the back of the office was slowly sliding open on its own, as if someone had reached inside and was rifling through the papers. She turned back to the shadow, but was gone. The office was empty once again, silent. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The only thing she could think to do was leave. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she grabbed her purse and phone, rushing toward the elevator. As she neared the elevator, she could hear faint whispers, like voices in the walls, murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside, hands trembling as she hit the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut, and Sarah pressed her back against the wall, trying to calm her breathing. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching her, waiting. The elevator descended slowly, the floors passing beneath her as she glanced nervously at the reflection in the glass doors. The last thing she expected was the faint outline of a figure standing behind her, just out of sight. The elevator stopped at the ground floor. The doors opened. Sarah didn't look back. She ran out into the lobby and out into the cold night air, her heart still racing in her chest. She never returned to the office after that night. No one ever believed her when she told them what had happened, and she never spoke about it again. But every now and then, when she drives past the building, she can't help but glance up at the windows on the upper floors, half expecting to see something or someone watching her from the darkness. Story the end.
Story number 4.
Here's the story. The office was empty, as usual. Karen sat in front of her desk, typing away at the report that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The clock on the wall ticked toward 10 p.m., the time she had set aside to finish up. She had gotten used to working late. It wasn't ideal, but it came with the job. The building was always quiet after hours, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the hum of the air conditioning. It had always felt peaceful at night, in a way that made the long hours bearable. But tonight, something felt off. She paused, looking around the office. The open floor plan made it easy to see every desk in the large room, and every cubicle stood empty in the dim light. The only sound in the space was the faint clicking of her keyboard and the low buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. The building was old, one of those downtown buildings with character, creaky floors, drafty hallways, and a general sense that it had seen better days. She stood up and stretched her back, glancing over at the clock again. The minutes seemed to drag on. With the deadlines mounting, Karen had no choice but to stay a little longer. She grabbed her coffee mug from the side of her desk and made her way toward the break room. As she passed the row of cubicles, she felt a slight shiver run down her spine. The air was colder than usual, but she chalked it up to the air conditioning and continued on. When she stepped into the break room, the light above flickered. She paused, waiting for the inevitable buzzing sound as the bulb died, but it came back to life after a moment. Karen rolled her eyes, muttering to herself, "Great, just what I need tonight." The break room was quiet, and the dim light made it feel even more isolated than usual. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, trying to shake the odd sense of unease that had settled in her chest. The building had always been a little creepy at night, but tonight it felt different. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't ignore. She turned to leave, but before she could exit the break room, a soft sound came from the hallway. It was faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the otherwise silent office. Karen froze. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the cubicles. She tried to convince herself that it was just someone else who had stayed late. Maybe a coworker she hadn't seen yet, but she knew it was unlikely. No one else was supposed to be in the building. Her coworkers had all left hours ago, and she was the last one remaining. She walked cautiously back into the hallway, her heart racing in her chest. She called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps stopped. She stood still for a moment, straining her ears. The silence felt unnervingly thick. There was no sound, no creaking of the floor, no buzz of the lights, just silence. Her stomach twisted, but she took a deep breath and began walking toward the direction of the sound. It was probably nothing, she told herself, just the building settling. As she reached the edge of the cubicles, she noticed something strange. One of the office chairs was facing the wrong direction. Turned around, its back to the desk. The desk itself was empty, the computer off, papers neatly stacked in their usual spot. But the chair had definitely been facing the desk when she had walked by earlier. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to make of it. She glanced down the hallway again, her skin prickling as she looked for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the same quiet, dark hallway stretching out before her. "Okay, this is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "It's probably just a draft or maybe someone came in after hours." But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that strange, nagging sense that she wasn't alone in the building. She took another step forward, her eyes scanning the dimly lit office. The air was colder now, much colder than it had been earlier. She could see her breath in the air, like a fine mist rising from her lips. That's when the sound came again. A soft, scraping noise, followed by a faint tapping, almost like fingers brushing lightly against the surface of a desk. Karen's heart skipped a beat, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned quickly, scanning the office, but there was no one. Just the empty desks and the quiet hum of the lights above. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, Karen stood frozen in place, her eyes darting around the room. She was sure she hadn't imagined it. That sound had been real, and it was coming from one of the desks nearby. She took a step forward, trying to calm herself, trying to rationalize the situation. It was just the building, she told herself again. Just the building. But then something else happened. The printer, which had been off all night, suddenly came to life. Its motor hummed loudly, and the printer tray clattered as paper began to feed through. Karen's pulse quickened, and she rushed toward it. The printer was spitting out sheets of paper, but they were blank, pure white sheets, one after another, with nothing on them. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stood frozen, staring at the machine as it printed out empty sheets of paper. It was absurd. It didn't make any sense. She grabbed the paper from the tray, Crumpling it in her hands, and tried to calm herself. "Just get a grip, Karen," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "It's late. You're tired. This is nothing." But as she turned to leave, she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, at the very edge of the office space, a figure stood. It was tall, shadowy, and indistinct, just a dark shape at the edge of her vision. Karen's heart raced as she stared at it, her body stiff with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching her. She couldn't breathe. She felt paralyzed, like her feet were glued to the floor. And then, as if the figure had heard her thoughts, it began to move. Slowly, it glided toward her, its form still unclear, its movements unnaturally smooth. Karen's mind screamed at her run, but her body wouldn't obey. She stood there, frozen, staring at the approaching figure. As it drew closer, she finally saw something, a flash of pale light, like a face peering from the darkness. "Karen," the figure whispered, its voice low and raspy, like it was coming from deep within the earth. Her breath hitched, and she took a step back, still unable to tear her gaze away. What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely a sound. The figure didn't answer. It just continued to glide toward her, its form growing clearer until it was right in front of her. It was no longer just a shadow, it was a person. A person who shouldn't have been there, a person who was dead. The room grew colder still. The figure raised a hand, and Karen could feel the temperature drop even further. Her mind raced, and she instinctively took another step back, finally breaking free from the trance that had held her in place. She spun around and ran toward the elevator, desperate to get out of the building. As she reached the elevator, she heard a soft whisper behind her. "You can't leave." Karen slammed her finger on the elevator button, her heart pounding in her chest. The doors opened, and she stepped inside, pressing the ground floor button with shaking hands. The doors closed, and she collapsed against the wall of the elevator, her breath coming in short gasps. When she finally reached the ground floor, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her things, rushed out of the building, and never looked back. The next morning, when she returned to work, she was met with an eerie silence. The lights were on, the office was empty, and everything looked normal. But Karen knew what she had seen, and she knew she would never be alone at work again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was a Tuesday night, just past 9 p.m., when I found myself alone at the office again. I had become accustomed to staying late to catch up on work, especially with the looming deadline for a project that seemed to never end. The office was quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rattle from the aging building. I had always preferred being alone in the office after hours. There was a certain peace in it. The space was mine, no distractions, no buzzing phones, just the soothing rhythm of my typing and the soft murmur of distant traffic outside. But tonight, the usual sense of calm felt strangely absent. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 9:30. I'd been working steadily for the past few hours, and I had finally managed to get through most of my tasks. But as I sat there, typing up the last report, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The office was empty. My coworkers had all gone home hours ago. The building was always eerily silent at night, but tonight it felt like the silence had weight to it, pressing down on me from all directions. I could hear the faintest noises, soft creaks, like footsteps echoing in the hall, though I was the only one here. I shrugged it off, trying to concentrate on my work, but the noises didn't stop. They continued, just at the edge of my hearing. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking through the hallway outside my office door. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My heart rate picked up, but I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling. I had worked late plenty of times before, and this was nothing new. Still, I couldn't help but glance toward the door, half expecting someone to walk in. The footsteps stopped abruptly. My throat went dry, and I found myself holding my breath. There was no reason for anyone to be here. I had checked the building's security cameras earlier, and no one else had entered after my colleagues left. I was absolutely alone. But the silence that followed the footsteps felt different. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was more like an oppressive presence, like something was lurking just beyond my line of sight, waiting. I tried to focus on my screen again, but my eyes kept darting toward the hallway. Every muscle in my body was tense, coiled with a growing sense of unease. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, so faint that at first I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. I looked up from my desk, heart pounding. There was no one there. I was still alone. But then it came again. The whisper, closer this time. It was a voice barely audible, like it was coming from behind me. Help. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. The voice had been clear, desperate, and filled with a deep, unsettling sorrow. It was a voice I didn't recognize, and it didn't make sense. I slowly turned in my chair, but there was nothing. The office was still empty, bathed in the harsh, artificial light of the overhead bulbs. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I stood up, every part of me screaming to leave, but I forced myself to step toward the hallway. I needed to know what was happening. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe the old building was just playing tricks on me. And I didn't believe in ghosts, but the feeling in the air was becoming too much to ignore. I walked cautiously to the end of the hall, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The hallway was long, lined with closed office doors and storage rooms. The only light was the faint glow from the emergency exit sign at the far end. I passed the break room, the kitchen, and finally reached the door to the storage area. As I approached, I felt the temperature drop sharply. The air felt heavy, thick, like I was walking through something dense, something cold. I reached for the door handle, and the moment my fingers touched it, I froze. There was something inside. I could feel it, a presence just on the other side, waiting. I pulled my hand back, but something made me hesitate. I didn't know what it was, but I felt drawn to open the door. Something or someone was in there. The whispering voice echoed in my mind, and despite every instinct telling me to leave, I turned the handle and slowly pushed the door open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing the dark, dusty storage room. It smelled of old paper and chemicals, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a weak, flickering glow. I took a step inside, my shoes making soft thuds on the concrete floor. The room was full of old office furniture, boxes, and forgotten supplies. But as I moved further into the room, I saw it. A shadow. Not a natural one, but a dark shape moving in the corner, flickering in the dim light. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as the shadow seemed to grow, shifting and swirling like smoke. It was moving closer, and I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. And then it stopped. The shadow hovered in the air before dissipating into nothingness, leaving the room eerily still. I was paralyzed, like standing in the middle of the room, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. The silence was deafening. Then the whisper came again. This time it was louder, clearer. "Help." I spun around, my breath shallow. There was no one there. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over the uneven floor, and I bolted out of the room. As I ran down the hallway toward my office, the lights flickered again, and I could feel the air grow colder with each step. I reached my desk, my heart racing, and I grabbed my phone. I was about to call someone, anyone, but the phone slipped from my trembling hands and clattered onto the floor. When I bent down to pick it up, something caught my eye. On the desk, directly in front of me, was a piece of paper. I hadn't left it there. It was a note, written in thick, messy handwriting. I unfolded it slowly, my hands shaking. "Don't leave." The words felt like they were carved into my mind, an imprint that I couldn't escape. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my things, rushed out of the building, and didn't look back. I didn't care if I left my keys behind. I just had to get out. I haven't returned to the office since that night. I don't know what happened or if it was all in my head, but the feeling of that cold presence, the whispering voice, still haunts me. Every night I can hear it in my mind, always saying the same thing. Help. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The clock on the wall read 10:45 p.m. Ashley was the only one left in the office. Everyone else had left hours ago, as usual. She didn't mind. Working late had become a routine for her. The silence was peaceful, allowing her to get things done without the usual distractions. The office, located in an old building downtown, had a certain charm. The creaky floors, the exposed brick walls, the low hum of the old fluorescent lights, it all felt comforting in its own way. But tonight, something felt different. She glanced at her screen, where a report stared back at her, waiting to be finished. Ashley sighed and leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms above her head. The office was almost unnervingly quiet. No phones ringing, no conversations echoing through the hallways, just the soft clicking of her keyboard and the occasional whir of the air conditioning. The building had always felt a bit strange at night, but Ashley had grown used to it. Still, there were times when the quiet felt too thick, too heavy. She had heard the rumors about the building, how it had been constructed in the 1920s, how people claimed to see figures in the corners of their eyes, how objects would move on their own, but Ashley never put much stock in those stories. They were just that, stories. Urban legends. Tonight, however, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Every so often, she would glance up from her screen, her eyes scanning the office, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway or moving across the floor. But every time, the space remained empty. Ashley shook her head, trying to focus. She didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in any of that supernatural nonsense. Still, she couldn't ignore the eerie feeling creeping up her spine. She stood up to get a cup of coffee, hoping the hot drink would calm her nerves. As she walked toward the break room, she heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from behind her. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking in her direction. Ashley stopped in her tracks. She turned, expecting to see one of the janitors or perhaps a late-night worker heading toward the restrooms, but there was no one there. The hallway was completely empty. Her heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was just the sound of the building settling. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing. But as she continued toward the break room, the footsteps resumed, louder now, closer. She spun around again. Nothing. Just the dim light of the hallway and the quiet emptiness. Ashley's pulse quickened. She grabbed the handle of the break room door and swung it open, stepping inside. She needed a break from the tension, a moment to collect herself. The room was empty, as expected. The coffee machine sat on the counter, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. She filled her mug and took a sip, trying to steady her nerves. She glanced at the clock again, 10:55 p.m. Only an hour left. She could make it. As she stood there, the hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. But then, just as she was about to turn and leave, she heard it again. A door opening. A faint creak from somewhere down the hallway. Ashley's heart skipped. She set her mug down on the counter and stepped back into the main office, her eyes darting toward the hallway. The door at the far end of the office was slightly ajar, though she could have sworn it had been closed earlier. She knew that door led to the storage room, where old files were kept. It was probably nothing, she thought. Maybe the cleaning crew had left it open. But as she walked toward the hallway, the air grew colder and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She reached the door and pushed it open, the creaking sound echoing through the empty space. The storage room was dark, the only light coming from the dim office behind her. There was no one inside, just boxes, old filing cabinets, and stacks of paper. Yet something didn't feel right. The room was colder than it should have been, a chill that seeped into her bones. A strange feeling settled in her chest, something heavy, oppressive, as though the air itself was thickening around her. That's when she heard it, a soft whisper, so quiet she wasn't sure if she'd imagined it. But there it was again, faint but unmistakable. Ashley? She froze. The voice was low, almost a breath, but it was definitely there. Ashley? Her blood ran cold. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was still wide open, the dim light from the hallway barely reaching the corners of the room, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow, nothing but the emptiness of the storage room. Her hands trembled as she closed the door behind her, her mind racing. She was sure she had heard the voice. It wasn't her imagination. Ashley quickly walked back to her desk, trying to calm her breathing. She needed to finish this report and leave. She needed to get out of here. But as she sat back down at her desk, she noticed something strange. Her computer screen, which had been open to the report she was working on, was now showing a blank document. The cursor blinked in the top left corner, waiting for her to type something. That wasn't possible. She hadn't closed the document. She hadn't touched her keyboard in the last few minutes. Her fingers hovered over the keys, but she couldn't bring herself to type. The coldness in the air had intensified, and the weight in her chest grew heavier. It was as though something was pressing down on her, suffocating her. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out completely. The office was plunged into darkness. Ashley's breath caught in her throat. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight as she scanned the room. The dim light illuminated the walls, the desks, the empty chairs. Everything seemed normal, except for the oppressive silence that hung in the air. Then she heard it. A soft scraping sound like something or someone dragging itself across the floor. She turned toward the noise, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the faint beam of her phone's flashlight. Her pulse raced. The darkness seemed to close in around her, and the weight of the silence was unbearable. The scraping sound continued, growing louder as though it was moving closer to her. Ashley. She spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the room, but the source of the voice was still out of sight. She couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her purse, her phone, and rushed toward the exit. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted toward the door, the scraping sound following her every step. Just as she reached the door, the lights flickered back on. The office was normal again. No sign of movement, no more whispers. The door swung open with a sharp click, and she rushed out into the night air. She didn't stop until she was safely in her car, the engine running, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. Ashley never returned to the office after that night. She found another job, one that didn't involve long hours alone in a building that felt as though it was alive watching her. The office still stands, though. The lights still flicker at night, and sometimes when the wind is just right, you can hear a faint whisper through the cracks of the windows. Ashley! Story the end.
Story number 7.
Here's the story. It was just past 9 p.m. when Lisa sat back in her chair staring at the pile of paperwork she still had to finish. The office was quiet. Too quiet. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound breaking the silence, and Lisa found herself glancing up at the clock every few minutes, counting down the time until she could leave. She hadn't meant to stay this late. She had come into the office early that morning, hoping to get ahead on a project. But as often happened, the day had dragged on, filled with meetings, phone calls, and constant interruptions. By the time the others had left for the night, she was still knee-deep in work. The building was old, the kind of place with creaky floors and an endless maze of hallways that always felt a little too empty once the sun went down. She'd never really liked working late, but it had become a necessary part of her job. The quietness was a relief, but also unnerving, and tonight it felt especially eerie. Lisa ran a hand through her hair, glancing at the empty cubicles around her. The office had been buzzing with activity all day, but now it was just her. The sense of isolation settled in, making her feel small and exposed. The thought that she was the only one left in the building made her uneasy. A sudden noise from behind her made her jump. She turned quickly, her heart racing. Her office was a corner one, and behind her was a small storage closet. The door was cracked open. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it was wide enough that she could see the shadows cast by the dim light above. For a moment, she thought she saw something shift in the darkened space. Probably just my imagination, she thought. She shook her head and turned back to the paperwork in front of her. But the sound came again, faint at first, but this time louder. A soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. Lisa's pulse quickened. She stared at the closet, her mind racing. No one else was in the office, and the cleaning crew wasn't supposed to arrive until the morning. So, who could be making that noise? "Hello," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. She stood up, her chair scraping across the floor, and slowly walked toward the closet. The office felt unnervingly cold now, the air thick with tension. As she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open with a shaky hand. Nothing, just boxes of old files and office supplies. The room was empty, but something about it didn't sit right with her. It felt off. She stepped back, but as she did, she heard another noise. This time it was unmistakable, a soft, uneven footstep, followed by another. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside her office, but the air in the room remained unnaturally still. Lisa's heart raced and her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. She rushed back to her desk, grabbing her phone. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed the building's security number, but the line just rang and rang. She bit her lip, trying to calm herself. It was probably just a late-night worker or one of the other offices, she told herself. The building was old, and the pipes and vents had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But then the door to her office opened. Lisa turned, her stomach dropping. The office door was still locked, and she hadn't heard anyone approach. Her eyes darted toward the entrance, but no one was there. The door was open, and the hallway beyond was dark. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The door had definitely been closed when she had entered the room earlier, and now it was ajar, as if someone had walked in, or worse, was standing on the other side. "Hello?" She called again, this time with more force, but her voice cracked. No response. She glanced around, looking for anything that could explain the situation. The room was still the same, but the sense of dread that had settled over her earlier had intensified. The darkness in the hallway seemed to stretch and deepen, as if it were moving toward her. The door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, the noise echoing through the empty office like a thunderclap. Lisa jumped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed to the door, trying to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something or someone was blocking it from the other side. She pressed her ear to the door, trying to listen. There was no sound, no footsteps, nothing. Suddenly, a cold chill swept through the room, and she could see her breath in the air, though the office had been warm just moments before. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone again, this time dialing the security number once more. But again, it went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. She turned to the window. The streetlights outside flickered, casting long, strange shadows across the empty parking lot. The building seemed to stretch, like it was growing taller and darker, the windows staring back at her like unblinking eyes. The lights above flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then, through the darkness, she saw it, standing just beyond the desk in the corner of the room. A figure. It was tall and thin, a silhouette of a person, but the shape was wrong. The figure didn't move, just stood there unmoving, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. Lisa's breath hitched, and she took a step back, her mind racing. Was this a joke? Was someone playing? Someone playing with her? But the figure wasn't moving, wasn't reacting. No one else was in the building. The figure didn't speak, but Lisa felt its presence, felt it watching her. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her legs felt heavy, and her body froze in place. Her gaze locked onto the shadow, unwilling to look away, but also unwilling to approach it. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. Lisa blinked, confused, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The room was still the same. There was no figure standing in the corner, no shadow looming over her. She wasn't sure whether to believe what she had just seen. The door to her office swung open again, this time without a sound. Lisa's heart raced in her chest as she took a cautious step toward it. She glanced into the hallway, but no one was there. She didn't need to think twice. She grabbed her coat and purse, practically running for the elevator. The building seemed to stretch on forever as she moved down the hallway, the soft glow of the emergency lights casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she didn't stop until the elevator doors closed behind her. As the elevator descended, Lisa felt the weight lift from her chest, but the unease still lingered. She knew something had been in that room with her. She knew she hadn't imagined it. And she wasn't sure if she would ever feel safe working late again. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was nearing 11 p.m., and Jenny was alone at work. The office building, an old structure downtown, was deserted except for her. Most of the employees had left hours ago, leaving only a few scattered reports and the low hum of the lights in the hallway. She didn't mind working late. In fact, she preferred it. The stillness of the building helped her focus. Tonight, though, something felt different. She sat at her desk, typing up an email, when she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. At first, she thought it was just the noise of the old building settling, or perhaps the air conditioning kicking on. But the sound of the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Jenny paused, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. She looked toward the hallway. It was empty, just the dim glow of the overhead lights casting long shadows across the floor. The footsteps stopped. She swallowed hard, trying to brush it off. It was nothing, she told herself, just the usual creaks and groans of the building. Her eyes flicked back to her screen, but the unease lingered, creeping up her spine. She didn't like being alone in this office, especially at night. There had always been something about it that made her skin crawl. The dark corners, the strange noises, the unsettling quiet. Jenny shook her head, focusing on the report she still had to finish. The sounds she had heard could have been explained. The building was old. It was probably just the wind or the HVAC system acting up. She tried to push the feeling out of her mind, but it wouldn't go away. Then the footsteps started again. Closer this time. Louder. This time, Jenny couldn't ignore them. She stood up, her heart pounding, and stepped cautiously toward the hallway. The footsteps grew louder with every step she took. She reached the edge of the hallway and peered around the corner, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. No one walking toward her, no one at the other end. The footsteps had stopped. Jenny's stomach churned. She turned back toward her desk, heart still racing. She was being paranoid, she told herself. But even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The office was silent again. She returned to her desk, her mind refusing to settle. She tried to focus on her work, but every little noise seemed to set her on edge. A flicker of the fluorescent lights, a sudden rustle in the hallway, the sound of a door creaking, then silence. She rubbed her temples, trying to calm herself. It was just the building, she thought. It was old. It was creaky. It made sounds all the time. It didn't mean anything. But then, a voice. "Aren't you gonna leave?" Jenny froze. The voice was low, raspy, almost like a whisper, but clear enough that she couldn't ignore it. Her eyes darted around the office, scanning the room. There was no one there. She swallowed hard, trying to control the rising panic in her chest. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the same unsettling silence. She shook her head, trying to convince herself that she had imagined it. The voice had been too faint, too indistinct. It could have been her imagination playing tricks on her, but something deep inside her told her it wasn't. She stood up again, more quickly this time. She walked over to the door to the stairwell, opening it cautiously. The stairwell was dark, and the heavy air felt oppressive. She stepped inside, but the door slammed shut behind her, making her jump. She turned around, but when she reached for the handle to open the door, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her. "Okay, stop! It's just the wind," she muttered, trying to steady her breathing. But she could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat echoing in the narrow space. She turned back toward the office, but the door was no longer the way she remembered. There was no longer the faint light from the hallway leaking through the crack. It was completely dark. She reached into her pocket for her phone, hoping to use the flashlight. But when she looked at the screen, it was dead. Her heart sank. "Hello?" she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. She heard the sound of movement, soft rustling like someone walking across the room. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward toward the stairs, not sure which direction to go. She felt trapped in the dark, her panic rising with every breath. And then the whisper again, clear as day. "Leave now." Jenny gasped, her legs shaking. The voice had come from behind her. She turned around, but no one was there. Just the empty stairwell. Just the shadows. With a frantic movement, she pushed on the door again. It opened this time, as if nothing had been blocking it. She hurried out, stumbling back into the hallway. The light flickered above her head, casting odd, distorted shadows that danced along the walls. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. She rushed back to her desk, trying to regain some semblance of control. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed her phone, this time making sure it was powered on. But the screen remained dark, completely unresponsive. She glanced around the office again, hoping to see someone, anyone, but the place was still as empty as it had been for hours. The oppressive silence returned, surrounding her. "Aren't you going to leave?" The voice again. Clear, unmistakable. Her breath came in quick gasps as she turned toward the source of the voice. But there was nothing there. Just the shadows, stretching across the walls, stretching toward her. This time, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her purse and her coat, running toward the elevator. The sound of footsteps followed her, too real to ignore. When she pressed the elevator button, it took longer than usual for the doors to open, as if the building itself was fighting against her. Finally, the doors opened. She stepped inside and hit the ground floor button. The elevator descended slowly, the faint buzzing of the machinery echoing in the quiet. She kept her eyes on the doors, waiting for them to open, for the nightmare to end. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and Jenny bolted out of the elevator into the lobby. She didn't stop to check if the doors had closed behind her. She just ran. The air outside felt like a lifeline, cool, real, solid. She didn't look back as she stepped onto the street and disappeared into the night. Jenny never went back to that office again. She found a new job across town, far from the building that had haunted her. But every so often, when the wind is still and the night is quiet, she still hears the whisper in her mind. Aren't you going to leave? Story the end.
Story number 9.
The clock on the wall struck 9:30 p.m., and Maria exhaled in relief. Another long day of paperwork was finally coming to an end, or so she thought. She had stayed late to finish an audit that was due first thing in the morning. Most of the office had emptied out hours ago, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly in the quiet space. The building was older, its walls thick with history, and the air carried the faint scent of dust. Maria had always felt somewhat uneasy working late, but tonight that unease settled deeper into her bones. The quiet was heavier than usual, the kind of quiet that only an empty office could offer. The distant hum of traffic outside barely reached her ears. She glanced at the clock again. A few more hours, she thought, and she could go home. The last of her coworkers had left just after 7 p.m. She had waved goodbye to them, knowing full well she would be alone for the rest of the night. She was used to the solitude at work. There was a certain peace in it, a chance to focus without distractions. But tonight, that peace felt different. She clicked through her computer files, trying to push aside the creeping sense of discomfort. It wasn't the building, exactly. It had always been a little creepy, but not in a dangerous way. The creaks of the old floors, the way the air vents rattled during the cold months, these were familiar sounds. Still, tonight, every tiny noise felt amplified, like someone was just behind her, waiting for her to notice. She adjusted the collar of her blouse, then stood up and walked toward the kitchenette at the back of the office to grab a cup of coffee. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as she stood at the counter. She filled her cup, then paused as something caught her attention, a faint rustling sound from the far side of the office. Her heart skipped a beat. It was quiet again, almost too quiet. She shrugged off the sensation, probably just the air conditioning or one of the old windows rattling. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. Her office was at the far end of the open workspace, near the windows that overlooked the street. From where she stood, she could see the faint glow of streetlights outside, and she turned to head back to her desk. That's when she saw it. The motion sensor light at the far end of the office flickered on, casting an eerie glow down the hallway. Maria froze, staring at the hallway that led to the storage area and bathroom. The light hadn't been on a second ago. She knew that for sure. She had always thought the motion sensors were faulty, but tonight, it was like they were just waiting for her to look. Maria's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes scanned the hallway, her heart racing. The building was empty. She was alone. Still, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. She took a deep breath and forced herself to take a step toward the hallway. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing softly in the empty office. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. A beat passed with no reply. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. She stepped into the hallway, her shoes clicking softly on the hardwood floors. The light at the far end was still on, and Maria could feel a slight chill in the air. It wasn't the temperature of the building, it was something else. She felt like she was walking through an unseen web, something that wasn't quite right, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Her eyes darted to the storage room door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, something she definitely hadn't left open. She hadn't even been to the storage room that day. It was locked when the office was closed for the night. Her pulse quickened. She walked toward it cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, revealing the darkened room. Boxes of old files, unused office supplies, and disorganized stacks of paperwork filled the small room. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, a whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. Maria's breath hitched. She felt the hairs on her neck stand up. The whisper wasn't coming from any of the boxes or supplies. It was coming from behind her. The hallway. She turned quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. The hallway was empty. The light was still on, casting long shadows along the walls, but there was no one there. She couldn't explain why, but Maria felt an overwhelming urge to leave. The air seemed thicker now, the stillness oppressive. The whisper had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She turned back to the storage room, ready to close the door and head back to her desk. But when she reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own. She jumped back, her heart leaping into her throat. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. She pulled harder, but it didn't move. Panic set in. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. It echoed through the building, as if someone had thrown something across the floor in the farthest corner of the office. She whirled around to face the noise, but no one was there. The office was as silent as it had been before. The doorknob to the storage room jiggled slightly, and Maria let out a shaky breath. She tried once more to open the door, and this time it gave way with a groan. She stumbled back as the door swung open to reveal the same empty storage room. But something was different now. The shadows were deeper, the air colder. The whisper had stopped, but now there was a heavy silence. The kind that weighed on you, filling the room like a presence that wasn't quite visible. Maria swallowed hard. Something felt wrong, so wrong that she wanted nothing more than to leave, to escape. But she was frozen in place, unable to move. Then a voice. It was faint, soft, almost like a breath on the back of her neck. Maria. Her blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, but it wasn't one she had heard in a long time. It was the voice of her former coworker, Tim, who had passed away unexpectedly several months ago. He had been with the company for years, but one day he simply didn't show up for work. They had found him at home. No one had understood what had happened. Maria stood there, trembling, her eyes wide as she listened. Maria, the voice whispered again, just behind her ear. The hairs on the back of her neck stood straight. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. Instead, she bolted, running as fast as she could toward the exit. The lights overhead flickered as she passed beneath them, and she could feel the temperature drop in the hallway. She didn't dare look back, but when she reached the lobby, the door was locked. She fumbled with the handle, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, just as she thought she was trapped, the door swung open. She didn't question it. She ran out into the night, her breath coming in short bursts, and didn't stop until she was safely in her car, speeding away from the office building. She didn't return to the office for a week, and when she finally did, everything seemed back to normal. The lights were on, the air was warm, and the building felt like it always had. But as Maria sat at her desk, a single paper, one she hadn't seen before, slipped from the stack in front of her. She glanced at it. It was an old memo from her former coworker, Tim, dated the day before his death. "Sorry I'm late," it read. "I'll be with you soon." Maria's heart skipped a beat, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching her from the shadows. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
It was 9:30 p.m., and Emily was the only one left at the office. Her colleagues had trickled out hours ago, leaving her alone to finish the last of the reports for the week. She didn't mind. The office was quiet, and the stillness gave her a sense of peace. The old building had character, the kind that most people found creepy, but she appreciated. The creaky floors, the high ceilings, and the large windows with worn-out frames all made the place feel alive in its own way. As she sat at her desk, the rhythmic hum of the lights and the occasional tap of her keyboard were the only sounds she could hear. Emily had always been someone who liked the solitude of the office late at night. It gave her space to think, to focus. However, tonight, something felt different. The building felt heavier, as though the air itself was thicker than usual. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was just the stress from the long workday that was getting to her. The sound of a door opening caught her attention. It was faint, almost like a creak. She turned toward the hallway, her eyes narrowing in the dim light. The hallway was empty. The office doors were all closed as they had been when she arrived earlier. There was no one left in the building, no one except her. Maybe it was just the old building settling, she reasoned. She tried to focus on her work again, but couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled in her chest. Every few minutes, she would glance up from her screen, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. The silence seemed to press in on her, making it harder to concentrate. She could almost hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Emily sighed and rubbed her eyes. "I need a break," she muttered to herself, standing up from her desk. She walked toward the small break room near the back of the office, her footsteps echoing in the quiet building. As she entered the room, she felt the temperature drop slightly, the air colder than it had been before. She shivered, but chalked it up to the old ventilation system. She poured herself a cup of coffee, hoping it would help calm her nerves. As she turned to leave, she heard something again, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the hallway. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Her first instinct was to check if someone had come back into the building, but the thought of a colleague returning this late was unlikely. Besides, the hallway was still empty when she glanced out from the break room. A sudden chill swept through the room, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She could feel it. Someone was watching her. She quickly turned off the lights in the break room, her pulse quickening. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, and she gripped her coffee mug tightly as if it could offer her some comfort. She slowly walked back toward her desk, glancing down the empty hallway once more. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, flickering once, then twice, before settling into their usual hum. Everything looked normal, but the air felt off. It was heavier now, like something was just waiting to happen. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She walked over, trying to focus on the task at hand. It was just a message from her friend Sarah. "Hope you're getting out soon. Don't stay too late." Emily smiled at the message, then locked her phone and set it back on the desk. But then she noticed something strange. The paper on her desk, the report she'd been working on, wasn't where she had left it. It was sitting on the edge of her desk, pushed slightly to the side. Emily frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. She was certain she hadn't moved it. She reached for the paper, her fingers brushing the edge of the document, but then she heard it. A soft voice, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere behind her. Emily. Her blood ran cold. She spun around, but there was no one there. The office was as empty as it had been the entire night. The whisper had been so clear, so real, that it sent a chill through her body. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She waited for a response, but there was only silence. She shook her head, trying to calm herself. It was just her mind playing tricks on her. The building was old, and old buildings made noises. That was all. But then the voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. Emily, her body went rigid. There was no mistaking it this time. The voice was coming from inside the room, from somewhere behind her. She could feel it, feel the weight of the presence in the air, pressing against her chest. She turned slowly, her pulse racing, and her eyes scanned the room. Nothing. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned back to the desk. The paper she had just been holding had moved again. It wasn't just pushed to the side. It was now completely shifted, placed neatly in the center of her desk as if someone had carefully arranged it. Her heart pounded in her ears as she took a step back. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the office number for the night security guard, hoping for some sort of explanation. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, finally, a voice on the other end of the line. "Hello, this is Dan. How can I help you?" "Dan, it's Emily. I think there's someone in the office. I'm hearing things and stuff keeps moving on its own. I don't know what's going on, but I'm freaking out." Her voice was frantic, barely above a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end. "You're sure you're alone in there?" Dan's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Yes, I'm alone. Everyone else left hours ago." Dan sighed, then spoke in a low voice. "I need you to listen carefully. This building, it's old. A lot of people have had strange experiences here, especially after hours. I'm not saying it's ghosts, but, well, things tend to happen when people are alone in the building. So Emily felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean things? Things move. Objects disappear. People hear voices. I know it sounds crazy, but trust me, if you're really hearing voices, you're not imagining it. Her stomach churned. Dan, I don't know what to do. I can't stay here alone anymore. Listen to me. Dan's voice was firm now. You need to leave. Now. Don't wait. Lock up and get out of there as quickly as you can. I'll be over in 10 minutes to check the building. Just don't stay alone. Emily didn't need to hear more. She grabbed her coat, her purse, and her phone, running toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, she heard it again, faint but unmistakable. Emily? This time, the voice was so close she could feel the air shift around her. Without a second thought, she threw open the door, sprinting down the hallway toward the exit. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she bolted through the empty lobby and out into the cool night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, where she fumbled with her keys, desperate to get away from the building. When Dan arrived 10 minutes later, the office was silent again. The door to the office building was locked, and the lights were off. There was no sign of anyone. He shook his head, knowing that it would only be a matter of time before someone else called, reporting the same strange occurrences. As for Emily, she never went back to the office again. She found another job in a different building, far away from the one that had haunted her that night. But every now and then she would still hear the faint whisper of her name echoing in the back of her mind. Emily. Story the end.